Luke chapter 6, 46 to 49. So that's Luke chapter 6, 46 to 49. So why do you keep calling me, Lord, Lord, when you don't do what I say? I will show you what it's like when someone comes to me, listens to my teaching, and then follows it. It is like a person building a house who digs deep and lays a foundation on solid rock. When the flood waters rise and break against that house, it stands firm because it is well built. But anyone who hears and doesn't obey is like a person who builds a house right on the ground without a foundation. When the floods sweep down against that house, it will collapse into a heap of ruins. The next scripture is 1 Kings 19, verse 11 to 13. Go out and stand before me on the mountain, the Lord told him. And as Elijah stood there, the Lord passed by, and a mighty windstorm hit the mountain. It was such a terrible blast that the rocks were torn loose, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was a sound of a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave.
Such good verses, both of those, aren't they? Right, I will pray before Rupert speaks to us. Lord, we thank you for the richness of your word. Thank you for Rupert and his wisdom and experience, what you've put on his heart to share with us this morning. And we just pray again that we would have ears to hear, and that you would bring your changes to our hearts and lives, our minds this morning. Amen.
Amen. Just trying to attach my microphone pack. Okay, here we go. Excellent. Thank you for reading those scriptures and for prayer. We're on week 2 of a new series which we've entitled Ancient Wisdom, thinking about monastic principles for contemporary living. And last week I talked a little bit about this call, this invitation to go deeper, to be more deeply rooted, to enter into this full life, this rich and satisfying life that Jesus offers us and invites us into. And that when we're in that place, when the winds come and the storms blow and the waters rise, that we are deeply rooted enough that this house that we have built endures. And last time we read Matthew's version of this little story that Abby read out again, this parable that Jesus tells. And somebody sent me an email this week, which I really appreciated, of just encouragement to me, but also just wrestling with what's been said. And that's so helpful because sometimes it can feel like I'm speaking into a vacuum, and just to realize that people are listening and then taking it and wrestling with it. And they referenced in this email Luke 6, which is Luke's version of this little story. And it has that same thing of this wise person. There's these two people, wise and foolish people, and they both hear the words of Jesus. And the thing that is different with the wise person, which has really shaken me over these last few years, is the wise person is the person who hears the words of Jesus and puts them into practice. And I don't know about you, but my issue around discipleship is not lack of knowledge. Anyone else? My issue around discipleship is doing what I know. And so Jesus says the wise person is the person who hears my words and puts them into practice. But I love this little thing that comes out in Luke's version of this story, is Luke says they're like a man building a house who dug down deep. Who dug down deep. That when the winds come and the rains come, when the winds blow and the rains come, then this house endures. And my sense is that in the midst of everything that's going on in the world around us and all the stuff that hits our own personal lives, we need to be more deeply rooted. That when stuff happens, which it inevitably does when life happens to us, that we're deeply rooted. And that's part of what we're going to continue to look at over these coming weeks, and I want to look at more today. And so we're learning from this ancient monastic tradition, which I introduced a little bit last week. Andrew's going to introduce more of it next week and talk a little bit more about the different monastic traditions and a bit more about the history of it. So, but I'm today and going to talk a little bit about prayer. Sometimes when you talk to people in the Protestant tradition, you can think that Christian history started at the Reformation. But actually we have this rich history of saints and Christians that have gone before us that can teach us and help us to navigate through life well. And so we're looking at this ancient monastic tradition. And I mentioned last week that the kind of prototype monastics were this group of people that were often called the desert mothers and fathers, that about the 4th century they went into the deserts in the Middle East, predominantly Egypt, and they began to live a little bit like hermits. Ascetic, gave up loads of kind of stuff, but they felt this call to really follow Jesus and to give their lives to being disciples of Jesus. And then they started gathering in communities, and then there was things called a rule of life that various ones started putting together about how these communities would come together and live together and pray together. And so that's part of what we're going to be looking at over these coming weeks. And we're going to learn from these monastics and see how that might help us as we think about who we are as a community of faith. We don't all live in one place or one building or one complex, but we live scattered around the city and beyond. But there's something that holds us together. And we, a few years ago, came up with these core these core principles, or these core reasons why we exist, which will come up on the next slide, that we exist to be as a community, as a church, a Christ-centered community, a community that gathers around Jesus, connected to one another because of our first prior connection and relationship with Jesus. And that as we do that, as we form this Christ-centered community, the goal is to see people fully alive. So Jesus invites us into this rich and satisfying life. But it often comes in the midst of struggle. It comes in the midst of putting things into practice and learning and wrestling and bouncing off one another and life and all those kind of things. But the goal is to see and to help people be fully alive, fully human, fully who we are meant to be. And so the hope that we have is not just a hope for the future when we die, but it's a hope that we have now, that Jesus can be so embodied in us as individuals and as a community that we experience his life. And then as we experience his life and community and relationship with him, that we help the world flourish. Because I think we've got something to offer, and I think some of these monastic principles that we're going to be looking at over these weeks are actually part of what the world is looking for but doesn't know where to find. There is an ancient wisdom that we have in a world that predominantly values knowledge over wisdom and has lost some of that. And so today we're going to dive into one of these, which is about prayer, or you could say devotion, or you could even say worship. I sometimes hear some of my church leader friends say, we need to pray more. Anybody heard anybody say that? We need to pray more. And what I think people mean by that is we need to intercede more. And if we intercede more, if we ask God for more things, and if we do it enough, often it seems like there's this weighing scales. You know, when we pray enough, then God somehow reluctantly will move. At least that's how I hear it. And I don't think God is reluctant to move. So in that sense, I want to say, no, we don't need to pray more. Of course, there's a place for intercession and asking things of God, but it's not some kind of weighing scales that when we've prayed enough, God reluctantly will move on our part. But what I want us to understand is that I think there's something from the monastic tradition which can really help us understand and broaden our understanding of prayer. And then I think there is a call. Actually, we do need to pray. Perhaps not more, but it needs to be a priority in our lives. And my hope is, and this is my prayer, Spirit of God, would you stir some really deep longings in our heart today? That we could hear the invitation and the call and the desire of the Spirit and our own soul to learn what it means to be with Jesus and to long for that more than anything else. And so, Spirit of God, I'm asking today that that's what you would do as we talk through this together. You see, the monastics had a much wider understanding of prayer than just intercession. In our tradition, we tend to think prayer equals intercession, but the monastics had a much wider understanding of that. I would want to say a much more biblical Jesus way of understanding what prayer was, which certainly includes intercession. Of course it does. But an intercession that flows from first being with Jesus. So the monastics often talked about communion with God. And in that place of communion or union with God, that we are transformed and we are changed. We, in our perhaps more contemporary language, John Mark Comer's particularly used this language, which I find very helpful, is the first call on our lives is to be with Jesus. And as we be with Jesus, we become like Jesus. We are transformed and changed to become more like him. There is a Spanish mystic. We want to introduce you to a few of these kind of mystics and monastics, contemporary story that Andrew told today, or more, at least more contemporary, but some of them going back a long way. So there is a Spanish mystic called St. Teresa of Avila. They're not all men, which is great to hear. So St. Teresa was a Carmelite nun, and she wrote extensively about prayer. You'll see a statue, which I'm assuming is not a lifelike representation of who she was, and she lived many, many years ago, and she says prayer is an intimate friendship, a frequent conversation held alone with the one whom we know loves us. Prayer is primarily about communion, being, relationship. There's this wonderful story that I came across in reading a number of books about this, of a missionary in Africa who noticed how a local man would go into the church every day, where he would spend 2 or 3 hours inside on a bench. And the missionary had no idea what he was doing. So eventually he walked up to the man and he asked, "What are you doing here?" And this man looked at him in surprise and replied, "Don't you understand? I'm meeting God. He is looking at me, and I am looking at him." I think that's such a brilliant definition of prayer. He is looking at me, and I am looking at him. Now, that's all true, but it all sounds terribly nice, doesn't it? And one of the things that we learn about prayer and the monastics is that prayer was a place of encounter with God, but also an encounter with ourselves. And that in that place, there was often a wrestling with the dark side of who we are. And it was often based around the story of Jesus going into the desert for 40 days, praying and fasting. And then this place of temptation, what emerges in that place of prayer are some of these deep, profound temptations and voices that emerge within us. And it's a place often of struggle, of battle. I was really struck about this verse in John 10 where Jesus says, I've come that you might have this rich and satisfying life. Or life and life in all its fullness, if you remember the older translation. I can't remember what that is. But we've often left off the first part of that verse, which talks about there is a thief that is trying to kill, steal, and destroy. So life only comes in the midst of struggle. And the monastics realized that prayer was a place of struggle, primarily a struggle with self. In the place of prayer, we encounter ourselves. And so there's this brilliant story, which I find really helpful, just thinking about the place of prayer and encountering myself, that comes from these desert fathers. And a few visitors had come to see this solitary monk. And they asked him, what is the meaning of your life of silence? And that monk was busy drawing water from the well. So he spoke to the visitors and he said, look into the well, what do you see? And the people looked in the well and they said, well, we don't see anything. And after a short while, the monk asked the visitors again, go and look in the well, what do you now see? And the visitors looked in the well again and they said, now we see ourselves. The monk explained, you see, when I was drawing water, the surface of the water was moving. Now the water is calm. You can see yourself. That is the experience of silence. It's a place of encounter of our true self. There's a famous saying of another of the desert fathers, a chap called Abba Moses. And he says, go and sit in your cell, in other words, your place of prayer, and your cell will teach you everything. The monastics, the monks, the nuns, prayer was absolutely central and priority to all that they did. There's a chap called Henri Nouwen, which many of us may have heard of. He was actually a priest, an author, but draws, I think, extensively on this monastic tradition. And he has this really interesting progression that he sees from the life of Jesus, and he particularly talks about it from Luke chapter 6, a bit earlier in the chapter from the bit that we read today, where Jesus calls his disciples. And the first thing that Jesus does is he goes up a mountain to pray. And he spends the night in prayer. And then the second thing he does is he calls his 12 disciples. And then thirdly, the crowds come. And they pray for the sick and see them healed. And Nouwen says that needs to be the order, the priority that we have in our own lives. He talks about it in terms of solitude rather than prayer. As we'll see in a minute, that solitude is a key part of prayer. So he talks about solitude, and he says that the first thing that we need in our lives is that place of solitude. It's the going up the mountain on our own to be with God. It's the communion with God. It's him looking at me and me looking at him. Then the second thing is community. Jesus gathering his disciples. And then the third thing is the place of mission or service, or what Nouwen calls ministry. So So often we do it the other way round. We start with a place of activity, of doing things, of mission, of what's our place in the world. What are we going to do? And then we realize we need a community of people that will help us or support us or be around us as we do those things. And then finally, when we realize that actually even that's not enough, we turn to prayer. Nouwen says it needs to be the other way around. We start with this place of being with Jesus. And then we find our people, our community. And then we do whatever it is that will flow out of that. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German Christian author, he talks about how community becomes a distraction for us. When we're not comfortable with who we are, with being alone, being on our own with God, we form or join a community to avoid the primary call, the first call to be alone with Jesus. So we fill our lives with noise, activity, people, or busyness. Gosh, I just think this is so penetrating in our current culture, eh? He says we're running from our issues. So Bonhoeffer says, let him who cannot be alone beware of being in community. But he also says the reverse is true. Let him who's not in community beware of being alone. I was reading a book called The Monastic Way, and the author of this book says, I like to think that I don't pray because I'm too busy. She says, if I'm really honest, it's not busyness, there's always time. Actually, it's the hardness of my heart. It's I don't really want to. I find that really challenging. Now, of course, there's other things that we have to do. We're not living in a monastery. We don't have 24 hours a day or whatever to do that. Of course there is. But I wonder how much we don't pray because we're avoiding being alone with God. Because it's the place where we encounter our true selves. And sometimes that's not very comfortable. What really emerges is some of the deeper things that are going on in our hearts and our lives. And so for CCE, the first thing is a community that gathers firstly around Jesus. We're a Christ-centered community. It starts with who we are. It starts with being alone with Jesus. And Nouwen says, Henri Nouwen, in this progression of solitude or prayer to community to mission or ministry, he says what happens when you start to pray is that you hear all these voices that start emerging from within us that have a huge congruence with the voices of the evil one that came to Jesus in the temptations. Prove that you are the beloved. Prove that you're worth something. Do something relevant. Make a name for yourself. Have some power. Then people will love you. Then people will say that you're wonderful and that you're great. And Nouwen says that we need to get alone with God. Because it's when we're alone with God that we create enough space, like the knitting. We create enough space to hear the voice of God say something deep into our soul. So Nouwen says it's important to pray, because it's the place in which you can listen to the voice of the one who calls you the beloved. To pray is to listen to the one who calls you my beloved daughter, my beloved son, my beloved child. To pray is to let that voice speak to the center of your being, to your guts, and let that voice resound in your whole being. Now, that's not easy. We know it up here, but to really hear that voice, profoundly hear, is not easy and not quick. So Nouwen says you have to pray. You have to listen to the voice who calls you the beloved, because otherwise you will run around begging for affirmation, for praise, for success. And then you're not free. I think it was a mystic called Thomas à Kempis who said, the only person who should speak in public is somebody who'd rather be at home. The only person who should speak in public is somebody who'd rather be at home. Gosh, I might never have done anything. That's not a quick or easy journey. So the monastics realized that you have to create space for God in our lives. Not just once, not just occasionally, but regularly. And there are many, many, many huge varieties and different ways in which we can pray. But I just want to talk about a couple of things that I think emerge from the monastic tradition that I would want to offer is a key part of our putting it into practice. And the first thing is the place of silence and solitude, which leads to stillness, inner stillness. And it's in that place of inner stillness that we hear the voice of God. So there's this story in 1 Kings that we read out of Elijah who's in this kind of battle with Jezebel and Ahab, and he's run away to the mountain, and the Lord is going to meet him at this mountain. And the wind comes, but the Lord was not in the wind, and the earthquake comes, and the Lord was not in the earthquake, and there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. The Lord wasn't in all the dramatic, external, noisy things. And then there's this phrase that in different translations are talked about the sound of a gentle whisper, or sometimes it's like the breath, a breeze. But actually in the Hebrew, it says, after the fire, there was the sound of sheer silence. Well, how do you have the sound of sheer silence? But that's what it literally says. It's the sound of sheer silence. And then it says Elijah heard the silence. So no wonder the translators talk about it being a gentle whisper. But actually the word was silence. And it was in the silence that God revealed himself. That God spoke to Elijah. In the midst of the busyness of life, this space for prayer, for being with Jesus, for learning to be in silence and solitude, allows us to enter the place of inner stillness where all the voices that are churning around our heads begin to quieten down. That gives the opportunity and the space for us to see God afresh. and to hear him. And I don't know if you've tried silence. Most people's experience of silence is actually you sit there and you go, oh, I need to get that from the shops, or I've forgotten to do that. Anybody else? And this is why the monastics teach that we need to create rhythms to learn how to do this over many years. And as you practice it, those internal voices can begin to quieten down, and we can learn what it means to have God look at us and us look at him. All the monastic traditions have silence as a key part of their prayer practice. Some monastic traditions, it would be, I think most monastic traditions, it would be over meal times. There's the silence of evening and night. Some monastic traditions take it a lot further, and silence is only really broken for community prayer a few times a day, and then a community walk once a week. Otherwise, these monks are in silence all the time. Now, as we consider monastic principles for contemporary living in our own context, I think we're unlikely to take it that far. But how do we create spaces for prayer and silence and solitude in our lives? I came across this phrase a couple of years ago, a bit more. How do you befriend silence? If silence is so important that these Christians of old, all Christians of all kinds of different traditions, but who've learned from the monastics, say silence is a key part of our learning how to be with Jesus. How can we befriend silence in a noisy world? And how do I befriend silence as an extrovert? I love people. I love activity. I enjoy noise. Can I learn to turn the radio off? Stop listening to that podcast. Turn the telly off or Netflix off? Can I learn to make friends with silence? And in that place, have a fresh revelation of God. So the monastics talk about the need for structuring our prayer. Sometimes this is called fixed hour prayer or divine offices or daily office. Office comes from the Latin word opus, or work. And it was because the monastics saw that prayer was their first work, their primary thing. Everything else was secondary. Prayer was their first thing. Now, different monastic traditions have different rhythms of prayer. The Benedictines, I think, tend to pray 7 times a day. They'd get up at 3 in. Brutal. Not my scene. But then their last prayer's, 7:40 or 8 o'clock at night, and then they're in bed. I was reading somebody who said they went to a monastery and they had this rhythm of prayer, and they'd be up at 3 and then praying all these different times during the day. And the monks were in between these times of prayer all working. And he said, I was so exhausted. I just slept for the in-between bits, in between all these prayers. I mean, it's like extraordinary, isn't it? The Northumbria community, which I know Colin's been connected with for a number of years, that would be part of the new monastic, kind of trying to bring some of the monastic principles into everyday contemporary living. They have three times of prayer: morning prayer, midday prayer, evening prayer. So there's different ways of doing it. But this rhythm of prayer is just so helpful and holds people in different seasons of life. In our charismatic tradition, we've tended to emphasize spontaneous prayer, extempore prayer, our own prayers in our own words, not tied down by ritual or legalism. And there's something amazing about that. The other day, there was somebody who was praying for me on a Zoom call in the midst of a group. We'd just been sharing a bit of what was going on in our lives, and somebody prayed for me. And it was in their own words. It was extremely moving. It was like I was just listening into their conversation with Jesus about me. It was wonderful. So of course there's a place for this. But I do want to advocate for rhythms and structures. Unless we hear the words of Jesus and put them into practice, we will never be the wise man or woman. We need discipline and rhythm to hold us, to help us, and to deepen so that we can dig down deep. What that will look like is going to be different for each of us. It will maybe look different in different seasons of life. Start small. I've said this before, but when I was a very, very young lad, many moons ago, we had somebody who stood here and said, "Can you not pray for 1 hour a day?" So the next morning, I was like, yes, really fired up. Monday morning, 6 o'clock, alarm goes off. I think I just about made it to 7 o'clock. Tuesday morning, pretty sure I fell asleep by 6:30. Wednesday morning, it was probably 6:10. Thursday morning, I didn't wake up. And then I read a book and somebody said, "Can you not just do 10 minutes a day?" It's like, oh, not sure about 10, but I think I could do 5. So what I think is really interesting about the fixed hour prayer is it's not just a prayer to soup us up at the beginning of the day, to get us energized and then we forget about God. But it's about stopping regularly during the day for moments of prayer. I'm not in the season just at the moment, but there was a time when I was stuck an alarm on my watch and I'd just sit and read the Lord or recite the Lord's Prayer for 3 or 4 minutes at lunchtime every day, in the midst of a regular practice of first thing in the morning, last thing at night. How can we create these spaces for stopping and pausing, even just for a short time, in the midst of all the different things that are going on in our lives? Because I think these rhythms and these practices will teach us how to learn, so we can learn how to be in the place of silence and solitude, so that we find a place of inner stillness, inner rootedness, where we can hear the Spirit speaking, "You're my beloved," that holds us and roots us in the midst of all the stuff that's going on in our lives. And I just want to finish with a story from a chap called Ned Lunn, who I'd be very surprised if anybody's heard of, because I'd never heard of him. I just bought the book because I liked the title. Ash, Water, Oil. Why the church needs a new form of monasticism. And he says, he talks about his wife's illness, and he had these established rhythms of prayer, practices of prayer. And then his wife died. And he says this: "In the depths of bereavement, after my wife's death, this experience of being held in a rhythm saved my life." Wow, that's quite a thing to say, isn't it? Saved my life. when everything in my life was uncertain and the turmoil of the storm was overwhelming, the established stability of liturgical prayers held me like a boat. It is in these times of doubt, dryness in our devotion that an established rhythm of prayer holds and sustains us. So the monastics prioritize prayer, communion with God, learning how to be in silence and stillness, silence and solitude that led to stillness, with some really established rhythms of prayer that during the different seasons hold us. Because none of this stuff is easy. And I want to just finish by just saying this. I was listening to a podcast this week on solitude. And as I was listening to it, I was aware of this deep, profound longing that was bubbling up within me, like a deep sigh. This is what I long for. There are so many other things that I can be aware of what I long for. Vodka and tonic at 6 o'clock on a Friday night. Nice holiday. All kinds of stuff. But as I was listening to this podcast, I was like, oh, this is the deepest longing. Just to learn to be with Jesus. To learn to be in communion with him. To move towards union, oneness. To learn what it means to have him look at me and me look at him. Because in that place, I'm loved, I'm held, I'm okay. Rupert's okay. I don't have to be anything. I don't have to do anything. I can just be. That is the deepest, deepest longing of my heart. And as I was listening to this podcast, I was like, oh, this is what I really, really long for. If we can have the space, if we can create enough space in our lives to listen to the deepest longings of our soul, I want to say it's what we all long for. Deep down, it's what we all really long for. Mostly, our lives, my life, too busy, too noisy, too full of activity to be in touch with these deepest longings. So this morning, just for a few minutes, just as we finish, I want to invite you to listen, to see whether you can hear these deep longings of your own heart. My prayer, my expectation this morning, that as I've been speaking, rather than guilt or condemnation, my prayer is that there's this longing that's been bubbling up in our hearts, saying, oh, this is what I want to. I want to learn how to pray. I want to learn how to be with Jesus. I want to prioritize it in my life. I want to make some changes so this becomes the number one thing. Teach me how to pray, Lord. Start small, start sustainable, but please do something. Put it into practice. Let's just sit for a moment. Just in the silence of this moment, then maybe in a minute or two the band will just play. just let that longing bubble up within you. The Spirit is here to do his work, stirring something